Hello AP Psychology students, here we are again for another virtual lesson in our social psychology unit. Today the topic is conformity and obedience. Before we get into this, I think it's important to note this is a Monday afternoon. There are very few people here at school, teachers, obviously no students. I'm standing in front of an empty classroom talking to a camera, and yet one room away from me I can hear Mr. Perkins speaking through the wall, and so he must be giving an online lecture or whatever. He's still teaching very loudly. He is who he is. He's not going to change for anybody. I think we know that. Anyway, today is conformity and obedience. Now, I want to let you know up front that within these notes, there are going to be three specific experiments, very famous psychological experiments that we're going to talk about. One on conformity by Selma and Nash, and we'll see that in just a second. And then two on obedience, one of them by a guy named Stanley Ingram and one of them by a guy named Philip Zimbardo. Now, as far as the test is concerned, you are more likely to be asked questions about the experiments than about the specific concepts. The concepts are pretty simple and straightforward. Again, these are things that we live through every day. We understand these things, but the experiments and how they demonstrate what we learn about these concepts through the experiments, that's what you're most likely to ask about. So I'm going to spend a decent amount of time on the experiments. Anyway, when we say conformity, we all know what conformity is. What is it? It's when we change our behaviors, or maybe our thoughts or our actions, based on the peer pressure around us, either real or imagined. In other words, we basically, we conform to the group. We do what the group is doing, okay? So, and a key here, and I've got it underlined, is without being told to. Now, obedience and compliance, we're going to talk about that in a moment. If you're told to do something, that's a different story. This is just, we naturally do it. Without being told or without being prompted, we will naturally do what the people around us are doing or think the way they think. Now, as we do that, that creates something called social norms. These are unwritten rules of behavior that kind of guide the way we interact with each other, especially when we're out in public. And so they can either be implicit or explicit, and like I said, more often than not, they're unwritten, and they guide our behaviors. One of my favorite examples, of course, if you've ever gotten in an elevator with a bunch of strangers, we know what elevator etiquette is. Elevator etiquette is you stand facing the doors, and if you don't know anybody else in the elevator, if they're all strangers, nobody talks. It's very rare to have people talking in an elevator. Now, if you know somebody, well, that's another story. But if you're in that situation, and people have tried this before, and you turn around and you face the opposite direction the way everyone else is facing, it makes everyone very uncomfortable. You're breaking a social norm. Now, obviously, it's not a law that you're breaking or anything like that, but there's kind of this, that's not how you behave in that certain situation. So we have a lot of social norms about touching and personal space and things like that as we interact with each other, and we all kind of know what they are. And generally speaking, we follow them. Another thing that happens, this is kind of intriguing, to maintain social norms, we often exercise reciprocity. Reciprocity is when we respond to a behavior with the same behavior. An easy example, if you've ever been walking toward a door and arrive kind of at the same time as a stranger, if one of you opens that door for the other person, let's say there's a second set of doors shortly thereafter, if, say, the stranger opened the door for you and let you walk through, you will almost certainly open the door for the stranger and you let them go through, or vice versa. If you open the door for the stranger, they'll walk in, they'll say, hey, let me get that for you, and they open the next door. Now, if you don't do that, you generally don't hold, if the first person does not hold the door open, they kind of go through, they generally won't do it, it won't be reciprocated. But more often than not, we will mirror the behavior that other people have demonstrated to us. Another concept here, social contagion, and that is the idea that, again, we like to go with the group. We like to think the way they think. We like to act the way they act, do what they do, that kind of thing. And so examples that you all are familiar with, laughing. Obviously, if other people around you are laughing, even if you don't find it funny, a lot of times you laugh simply to conform. You don't want to look like you don't get the joke or you're left out or whatever else. Yawning, of course, that's a classic one. Somebody near you yawns. It's very contagious, right? You tend to yawn as well. In fact, even hearing about yawning can oftentimes make you yawn. So I'd be curious to know how many of you all yawned as I mentioned that, and you see it up here in writing. Clapping, Imagine yourself in an audience and somebody finishes with a speech or something along those lines. One person starts clapping, pretty much the entire audience is going to follow suit. Or if one person stands up to give a standing ovation, it's almost immediate. The rest of the entire audience will stand up as well. Crying, obviously, you see somebody else crying, it's easy to mimic their emotions and cry with them. And then, of course, checking cell phones. This is kind of interesting. I'm sure you've done this before. Somebody near you, you're talking with someone and they get up their cell phone and check it, and even without thinking about it, you kind of glance down at yours. Even though obviously there'd be no reason to, you didn't get an alert or anything, but they did it, so you tend to do it as well. All right, so that leads us into Solomon Ash's experiment on conformity. So let me set up the basics. You're going to see a video on this in just a moment, but let me set up the basics. So what he did is he brought in a group of people, and only one of them was a test subject. The others were all what's called confederates. And we may have used this term before. If we haven't, I know it's been a long time. So a good reminder, a confederate is, again, the easiest way of thinking of confederate, that's an actor. Someone who is in on the experiment. They've been told to behave in a particular way. Okay, so he'll bring in these people, usually around 6 or 7 or 8 people. He'll sit them in a semicircle, and he'll show them a series of slides like the one you see right here. Now in the slide you have this line right here, okay, that's the standard line, and then you have these other 3 lines labeled A, B, and C. And what he will do, what the psychologist will do, is he'll go around the room and ask each person which of these lines matches or is identical in length to this line. Now you're probably watching this at home and you're like, well, obviously it's A, right? There's no doubt this line is the same length as this line, right? So what he would do though is he would have the confederates or the actors deliberately all say the same wrong line. And so he asked the first person, which line is just like this one? And maybe the first person says B. And the second person says, oh, B, definitely. And the third person says, yes, it's B. And again, they're all confederates. They're all in on it. By the time they get to the test subject who's toward the end of the line, everybody else has said B. And so either if they say A, they do so very uncomfortably. They'll say, I think it's A. But you can tell there's almost anguish there. Like, why do I have to go against the group? More often than not, a lot of times they'll go with the group even though they know visually there's no way B is the right answer. Everyone else is saying B though, they tend to go with B as well. And so that's kind of how it's set up, just to show the power of conformity. So here's what's going to happen. At this point in the quiz, right underneath this video that you should be watching and listening to, there's another short video that kind of gives a setup of Solomon Ash's experiment. So what I want you to do right now is pause this video, right underneath it, play that video, and you may have a question or two on the quiz that relates to that specific video. When that video is finished, come back up to the top one and restart this, and we'll go over the findings of his experiment. So at this point, pause it, and I'll see you back in a moment. Okay, hopefully you paused it and you are now back. So you saw the video and kind of how the experiment was set up. Well, here's what we learned from the experiment, the findings of the Ash experiment. The first thing is, if the group is too small, usually less than 4 people, there's not enough peer pressure to get the test subject to go along with the group. So if there's only maybe 2 other people in the room and they both say B, the test subject is still likely to go with their gut and say A. If there's at least 4 or more than 4, there tends to be enough pressure for that person to say, oh, I'm going to go with the group, okay, even though I know it's wrong. The other thing they found is that of the confederates, the actors, they all have to say the same answer. They all have to along the B, 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 along the line. Now, if one of them, even one of them, says the other answer, says the right answer, A, when they get to the test subject, they'll say the right answer. They will not conform to the rest of the group. So it only takes one dissenter to get somebody to not go with the group. And the other thing he found is that there seemed to be no differences between men and women. They generally all went along with the group about the same amount of the time. Okay, so that was the Solomon Ash experiment. Now, obedience. Okay, so this is another animal here. Conformity is willingly going with the group. This is when you're told to do something and why we do it. So, what is obedience? Agreeing to an explicit or implicit request, especially because it came from a person of authority. And so, as you can see here, the highlight, the obedience is highest, tends to be highest when the person giving orders, like I said, is perceived as a legitimate authority. Obviously, if a 5-year-old is trying to tell you what to do, you're probably not going to do anything you don't want to do or are uncomfortable doing. If somebody who you perceive as being above you in authority over you tells you what to do, you are much more likely to obey. If the authority figure is supported by a powerful institution, or maybe a prestigious institution, if somebody says, I work with the government, or if somebody says, I work I'm from Harvard, or something along those lines, or if people have a uniform, which seems to indicate power and importance and things like that, you're much more likely to obey in that situation. And then if the victim, when we talk about this in a second with the experiments, if the victim is either depersonalized or they're at a distance, okay, that makes it easier. So if you, for whatever reason, have been trained not to think of them as a person, but maybe say as a number or as a test subject or whatever else, or if they're in another room and you can't see them, you are much more likely to do heinous things to them. So the two experiments that illustrate this, and so I want to let you know what this is going to look like. Right now I'm going to give you a quick rundown of the experiments. Tomorrow, what you're going to do is you're going to watch 2 videos, one on each. They're a little bit lengthier. That's why I'm not including it in this video and in this set of questions. I'm going to let that stand on its own. But tomorrow, what you're going to do is you're going to watch 2 videos, one on Stanley Milgram's experiment, the other one on Philip Zimbardo's, which is the Stanford prison experiment that some of you may have heard of. And so you're going to watch videos on those and answer questions. So I'm just going to give you the setup now, and then tomorrow's assignment is going to be watching those videos and answering your questions. But real quick, Stanley Milgram's. So what he did was he brought in test subjects and told them that they were going to be doing a study on memory, specifically the effects of punishment on memory. So he would bring in 2 people, and again, one of them was Confederate, okay, and then one of them was the test subject. And he had them draw a piece of paper. Now, both pieces of paper said teacher on them, okay? So no matter what, whichever paper the person chose, it was going to say teacher. The other one, though, the actor, so they both got teacher, but the actor would say, my paper says learner, okay? So the test subject would be the role of teacher, and the Confederate or the actor got the role of learner. And what happened was, so they showed the test subject, the teacher, they showed the teacher how they were strapping in the learner into a machine that was going to deliver them electric shocks. Then they took the teacher into a separate room, and they could communicate through, I think, microphones. They couldn't see each other, but they could communicate through microphones. And the teacher was told that you're to give a series of words, and they're supposed to answer questions about the words based on how much they remembered. And if they get the answer wrong, you are to administer an electric shock. Now, the electric shock starts off very mild, but as you're going to see in the video tomorrow, there was as you get a wrong answer, you continue to move up the ladder and administer stronger electric shocks. Now, at some point, now of course the learner was a Confederate actor. They were not actually being shocked, but as the teacher would administer the electric shocks and start giving more powerful electric shocks as a result of wrong answers, the Confederate, would begin to scream in agony and in pain, and the test subject, who was the teacher, was told to continue by the researcher, I need you to continue to administer these shocks. And so the theory was, people would drop out. People would say, I'm not comfortable administering it, and especially when they're literally screaming and writhing in pain and begging for them to stop and this and that, the Confederate was. Psychologists beforehand predicted that that nobody would take it all the way through to the end of, which is a very almost lethal shock level, voltage level. They predicted that very few people would get to that point. Interestingly, 60%, more than 60% of the test subjects continued to administer shocks right up to the very end. Now, not without some anguish, without some questions. I mean, they would say, I'm not comfortable doing this, I can't, and the psychologist, the researcher would say, I need you to continue to administer the shock, I need you to continue the experiment, and they would just keep going. And so it's the power of obedience and how it can cause us to do things that would be very much against what we would normally do. And then the other one has more to do with the power of the situation and the roles that people are placed in. So again, this is a very popular, very famous experiment, controversial of course, but Philip Zimbardo, he took 24 volunteers and they randomly drew either guard or prisoner in this mock prison scenario that he had set up. And so the guards were given uniforms, the prisoners were given prison garb and things like that. And it was supposed to last for 14 days to see how they interacted and how they conformed to those roles. Interestingly, and you're going to see in the video tomorrow, they had to stop after 6 days because the guards became so sadistic, so terrible in how they were demeaning the prisoners. Prisoners were literally, the test subjects that were prisoners were literally having psychological breakdowns as a result of the, again, to call it torture wouldn't be too, wouldn't be too much. So they had to stop that after a while, and again shows how people can conform to roles and do things that they normally wouldn't do. And this was a lot of, in part, a follow-up to World War II. And how could some of these Germans that were running the camps that the Jews were in, this and that, how could human beings do such terrible things to other human beings? And when they went to the Nuremberg trials, almost to a person, they all said, this is what we were ordered to do. We didn't have any other choice. And we all started to question, yes, but is there not a conscience? Isn't there something else going on that would tell you not to do these things? But it shows the power of obedience and the power that roles play when we're put in that situation. And so, like I said, tomorrow you're going to see another quiz that has these two, like I said, they're a little bit lengthy. That's why I didn't put them on today. I didn't want to make this too long. But you're going to see videos that kind of show you kind of the ins and outs of that. So thank you for tuning in. I've got to think of a good way to sign off. If you can think of a clever way for me to sign off these little lectures or these videos, or whatever you want to call them, email me or text me or whatever, let me know. Otherwise, hope you're all doing well. Again, I miss you guys, and if you have any questions, shoot me an email or text me, and hopefully I'll see you guys soon. Thank you.